I have replayed those 10 minutes so many times that I could probably recite them in my sleep frame by frame, like a movie I never wanted to watch twice. 10 minutes. That's all it took for 19 years of marriage to crack open right there in a grocery store parking lot under fluorescent lights and the smell of rotisserie chicken. I didn't know it yet, standing at that register with my card in my hand. I thought I was just buying groceries. I didn't know an old man named Frank was about to hand me the truth. It started like any other Saturday. Eric and I had a routine we'd kept for years: coffee first, then the farmer's market if the weather was decent, then the big grocery run at Riverside Market on Elm Street, the one with the wide aisles and the bakery that always smelled like cinnamon. We'd been doing this since before we bought the house. 19 years of marriage teaches you rhythms, and ours had always felt steady, comfortable. I used to tell my sister that Eric and I weren't the passionate kind of couple, but we were the kind that worked. Reliable, solid. That morning he'd worn his gray Henley, the one I bought him for his birthday 2 years back, and he'd kissed my forehead in the cereal aisle the way he always did, a small habit that had become so automatic I barely noticed it anymore. We filled the cart the way we always did, him grabbing the wrong brand of coffee on purpose just to make me laugh, me rolling my eyes and putting the right one in anyway. Normal, ordinary. The kind of Saturday you forget the moment it's over. We got to the checkout line around 11. I remember because the store was starting to fill up, families pushing carts with cranky toddlers, an older couple ahead of us, arguing gently about coupons. Eric touched my elbow and leaned in. "I'll just step outside," he said. 10 minutes. Need to take a call that Whitmore account is a mess." I nodded. This wasn't unusual. Eric was a financial consultant, and weekend calls happened more often than either of us liked. I told him to go, that I had it handled, and he smiled at me, that easy, warm smile that had gotten me through job losses and my mother's illness and every hard year in between, and walked toward the exit. I finished loading the groceries onto the belt. Paid. Bagged everything myself while I waited, because that's what you do, you keep your hands busy. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I checked my phone. No text. I stood near the exit doors with 2 full bags hanging off each arm, scanning the parking lot for him, for our navy blue Highlander, for anything. 15 minutes in. I felt the first flicker of unease, small and stupid, the kind you talk yourself out of. He's probably just parked farther back. He's probably on the phone still pacing. I almost went outside to look for him myself. That's when Frank found me. He was maybe 63, silver-haired, wearing the store's green vest, with a laminated badge that said, "Frank, 22 years. I'd seen him before, restocking shelves, always polite, always slow and careful with older customers who needed help reaching things. He approached me with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time. Not urgency exactly. Something more careful than that. Something that looked like he'd rehearsed what he was about to say. "Ma'am," he said quietly, glancing past me toward the registers like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "I think you should come with me." I laughed, a little confused. "Is something wrong with my card?" He didn't answer that. He just gestured toward a hallway near the pharmacy counter, a door marked, "Employees Only," and something in his face made the laugh die in my throat. I followed him. My bags were still hanging off my arms. I remember that detail specifically, how absurd I must have looked walking into a supermarket security office still holding 2 bags of groceries like I was about to make a delivery. The office was small, cluttered, a wall of monitors flickering with black and white footage from different corners of the store. Frank sat down at the desk and pulled up a recording, his fingers moving with the ease of someone who'd done this before, who'd had to show footage to people before. He didn't explain right away. He just pressed play. And there was Eric. Not outside, not in the parking lot making a call about the Whitmore account. He was in a back corridor near the loading dock, the one customers weren't supposed to use, standing close to a woman I didn't recognize. Dark blonde hair, maybe mid-40s, wearing a blazer that looked more suited to an office than a Saturday grocery run. They weren't touching. There was nothing scandalous in the footage, nothing I could point to and call proof of anything specific. But there was a familiarity in the way they stood, the way her hand rested briefly on his forearm, before dropping away, the way he tilted his head toward her, like they'd had this conversation 100 times before. "This isn't the first time," Frank said, not unkindly. "I've seen him back there a few times over the past couple months. Wasn't sure if I should say anything. But my wife, she passed a few years back, and I always wished somebody had told her things sooner rather than later." "So?" He shrugged like the explanation cost him something. Figured you'd want to know. I thanked him. I don't remember exactly what I said, something polite, something automatic, the kind of response your mouth gives when your mind hasn't caught up yet. I walked back out through the store, past the registers, out into the parking lot, and there was Eric leaning against the Highlander with his phone in his pocket, smiling like nothing in the world was wrong. Sorry, that took forever. Whitmore's a nightmare. He took the bags from my hands, brushed a kiss against my cheek. I smiled back. I said absolutely nothing. The drive home was quiet, in the way it always was, Eric talking about some client's tax situation, me nodding at the right moments. Nothing about my face gave anything away. 19 years of marriage, and it turned out I was better at hiding things than I ever imagined. Or maybe I just needed time. Time to understand what I'd actually seen. Time to decide what I was going to do with it. That night after dinner, after our usual routine of dishes and news and reading in bed, I noticed something I had never once seen in 19 years together. Eric reached over, turned his phone face down, and slid it beneath his pillow before he fell asleep. I lay there in the dark beside him for a long time, staring at the ceiling, listening to him breathe. I didn't confront him. I want to be honest about that because I know some people would have. Some women would have shaken him awake that very night and demanded answers, thrown accusations across the bedroom like knives. That has never been who I am. I am the kind of person who needs the whole picture before I make a move. And that Saturday night, lying next to a man I thought I knew completely, I understood I had only seen a fragment of something much larger. So I decided to wait, to watch, to learn. The next morning I bought a small notebook, the plain kind with a black cover, and I started writing things down. It felt strange at first, almost like I was betraying him just by paying attention. But I told myself I was simply gathering facts, the way Eric himself had taught me to when we argued about finances early in our marriage. Don't react emotionally. He used to say, look at the numbers, look at the pattern. So that's what I did. I looked for the pattern. Dates, times, the excuses he gave for being late or unreachable. I wrote them all down in that notebook tucked inside my nightstand drawer beneath a stack of old magazines. Every client meeting that ran long. Every phone call he took on the back porch with the door closed. Every Thursday evening he came home smelling faintly of a restaurant I didn't recognize, claiming it was a business lunch that had run into the afternoon. Within a week and a half, the pattern became undeniable. Every Thursday without fail. Every second Tuesday like clockwork. Always tied to some vague client name I could never quite pin down. Whitmore, then Sanderson, then a company called Ashford Group I'd never heard him mention before that month. I began to realize that these weren't spontaneous excuses. They were scheduled, practiced. A man doesn't accidentally develop a recurring bi-weekly pattern of disappearances unless he's protecting something on purpose. One Tuesday I told Eric I had a client dinner of my own, a lie, my first real lie to him in 19 years, and it came out of my mouth easier than I expected. Instead, I drove to the small business plaza off Route 9, the one he'd mentioned in passing as the location of his Ashford Group meeting. I parked across the street in the shadow of a dry cleaner's awning, and I waited. Eric arrived first, right on time, dressed in his charcoal suit, the one he wore for what he called important clients. He went inside a coffee shop. I recognized Bellamy's, the kind of place with exposed brick and expensive espresso. 20 minutes later, a woman arrived. I recognized her instantly from the security footage. Dark blonde hair, same blazer or one very much like it. She walked in alone, ordered at the counter alone, sat down across from him like this was routine. Like they'd done this so many times that the choreography no longer required thought. I watched them through the window for almost 40 minutes. What struck me most wasn't affection. There was no lingering touch, no stolen kiss. Nothing that screamed romance the way I had almost expected, almost hoped for in some strange way, because at least an affair would have been simple. What I saw instead was something quieter, and somehow more unsettling. Papers passed between them, a folder changing hands, Eric pointing to something on a page while she nodded, her expression serious. Focused, businesslike. They didn't arrive together. They didn't leave together. She left first, walking briskly to a silver sedan parked 2 blocks down. He left 10 minutes after checking his phone, adjusting his tie, driving home like nothing unusual had happened at all. That night, I lay awake again, turning it over. This isn't romance, I thought. Or if it is, it's wrapped around something else entirely. Something practiced, something careful. Two people who had done this dance enough times to know exactly how to avoid suspicion, exactly how long to wait between arrivals, exactly which entrance to use. Meanwhile, Eric himself seemed to be changing in small ways I doubt anyone but a wife of 19 years would have caught. His phone, which used to sit carelessly on the kitchen counter while he showered now, went with him everywhere, even to the bathroom, even to walk the dog. He changed his passcode twice in 2 weeks, and when I asked him about it casually, he mumbled something about work security protocols and changed the subject fast. He started taking evening walks alone. Phone pressed to his ear, voice low, and when I asked who he was talking to, he'd say, "Just work," in a tone that used to be light, and was now, if I listened closely, just slightly too quick. I never followed him on those walks. I told myself it wasn't the moment yet. I wasn't ready to know everything, and some instinct in me, the same instinct that had kept our marriage steady for 19 years, the instinct for patience, told me that if I pushed too soon he would simply get better at hiding, and I needed him careless a little while longer. So I watched, I documented. I filled that black notebook with dates and times and small inconsistencies that were beginning to form a shape I didn't yet understand, but which I knew somewhere deep in my chest was far bigger than a woman in a blazer at a coffee shop. Then, on a rainy Sunday afternoon while Eric was out at the gym, I sat down at the kitchen table to organize old tax documents, something I did every year around that time, a habit as routine as our Saturday grocery runs. I pulled out folders going back 6 years, sorting through W-2s and receipts and old bank statements, my mind only half on the task. That's when I saw it. Tucked inside a folder marked Investments 2021, half buried beneath old brokerage statements, was a single page listing an account number I had never seen before in my life. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time, just staring at the account number, as if staring hard enough might make it explain itself. 19 years of marriage, and I thought I knew every account we held, every statement that came through our mailbox, every line item on our joint tax return. This one wasn't joint. It wasn't even under a name I recognized, just a string of digits and a routing number attached to a bank I'd never heard Eric mention not once in nearly 2 decades together. I didn't say anything to him. By that point, silence had become its own kind of skill, something I was getting uncomfortably good at. Instead, the following Monday, I called Rebecca Lawson. I'd met Rebecca years earlier through a mutual friend back when she'd helped a coworker of mine through a messy custody situation. I remembered her as sharp, unflinching, the kind of woman who didn't waste time on comfort when facts were what mattered. I called her office and told her I needed a consultation. When she asked what regarding, I said simply, "I think my husband is hiding something. I don't know what yet." We met 2 days later in her office downtown, all clean lines and law books and a window that looked out over the river. I laid out what I had: the notebook, the photographs I'd quietly taken of Eric and the woman outside Bellamy's, and the strange account number from the tax folder. Rebecca listened without interrupting her pen moving steadily across a legal pad, and when I finished, she set the pen down and looked at me with an expression that wasn't quite sympathy. It was something more useful than that: focus. "Before you say a single word to him," she said, "we need to understand what we're dealing with financially. Confrontation without information is how people lose everything. Let's look at the money first." That was the beginning of weeks I can only describe as strange, quiet, methodical. Rebecca brought in a forensic accountant named David Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had the patience of someone who'd spent a career untangling other people's secrets. He asked me for access to every financial document I could gather: statements, tax filings, retirement account summaries, anything with our names on it and anything without. At first, everything looked ordinary. Eric had always managed our finances closely. It was his profession, after all, and I'd never had reason to question the numbers he showed me every year at tax time. Our joint accounts looked healthy. Our mortgage was on schedule. Nothing jumped out. Then David found the pattern. Small transfers. Modest, almost forgettable amounts. $400 here, $600 there, moving out of a business account. Eric managed independently, always staying just under the threshold that typically triggers automatic bank reporting. They occurred monthly, sometimes twice monthly, always on inconsistent dates that would have looked random to a casual glance. But David didn't glance casually. He built a spreadsheet month by month, year by year. And when he laid it out in front of Rebecca and me, the pattern was unmistakable. Every transfer without exception went to the same recipient, a limited liability company called Meridian Consulting Group. I looked into it. David said, sliding a folder across the table. On paper, Meridian is a business consulting firm. Registered 5 years ago, but there's almost no footprint. No real clients I could verify, no website worth mentioning, no evidence of actual consulting work being performed. And yet, it's received, he paused, checking his notes, just over $340,000 over the past 5 years. I remember the number landing somewhere in my chest like a stone dropped into water. $340,000. Money that had come from accounts I believed were simply funding Eric's business overhead software subscriptions, contractor fees, the ordinary costs of running a financial consulting practice. Instead, it had been quietly funneled month after month into a company that appeared to do almost nothing at all. Rebecca leaned forward, her voice measured but serious. Stephanie, I want to be honest with you. People don't usually build structures like this by accident, and they don't hide money this carefully unless they're planning for something. A divorce, a retirement they don't want you to know the size of, a future they're building without you in it. I sat with that for a long moment. My mind went back to the coffee shop, to the folder passed between Eric and the woman, to the careful, practiced way they'd avoided arriving or leaving together. I had assumed foolishly maybe that whatever connected them was emotional. An affair, even a long one, even a serious one, was something I could have eventually made sense of. Painful, yes. But understandable in the way that human weakness is understandable. This was different. This felt engineered. I think, I said slowly, testing the words as I spoke them, that she isn't just someone he's seeing. I think she's connected to this company somehow. Rebecca and David exchanged a look I couldn't quite read. That's exactly what we're going to find out, Rebecca said. David, can you pull the ownership records on Meridian? It took David 3 more days. Corporate filings in our state weren't always straightforward, especially for smaller LLCs that had been set up through registered agents specifically to obscure ownership. But David was patient and thorough, and on a Thursday evening, fittingly one of the days that had become part of Eric's regular pattern, my phone rang. I found the registered owner, David said. His voice was careful, the voice of a man who had delivered difficult news before and knew there was no gentle way to do it. I'm sending you the document now. I opened the file with my hands, not quite steady. A single-page official and unremarkable in its formatting, listing the founding member and sole owner of Meridian Consulting Group. I stared at the name for a long moment before it fully registered. It was her. The woman from the supermarket. The woman from Bellamy's. The woman whose hand had rested briefly on my husband's forearm in a security camera recording that had changed everything. Her name was Natalie Brooks. Natalie Brooks. I said the name out loud once alone in my car in the parking garage after leaving Rebecca's office just to see how it felt in my mouth. It felt like nothing. A stranger's name, ordinary and unremarkable, attached to a woman who had apparently been quietly reshaping my life for years without my knowledge. I started researching her the way I imagine most people do when they discover a stranger has become central to their marriage, carefully, obsessively late at night with a cup of tea going cold beside my laptop, while Eric slept upstairs unaware. Natalie's online presence was polished, professional, exactly what you'd expect from someone who wanted to project competence. Her LinkedIn described her as a strategic business consultant specializing in growth partnerships. Her profile photo showed her in the same style of blazer I'd seen at Bellamy's, smiling the confident, practiced smile of someone used to being taken seriously in rooms full of men. But Rebecca Ever Thorough went further than a LinkedIn scroll. She had a paralegal pull public court records, and what surfaced painted a different picture than the one Natalie had built online. 2 civil lawsuits from nearly a decade earlier, one from a former business partner alleging breach of contract, another from an investor claiming he'd been misled about the profitability of a company Natalie had helped run. Both cases had ended in settlements quiet and undisclosed, the kind of resolution that makes a problem disappear from public conversation without ever admitting fault. Nothing criminal, Rebecca clarified when she showed me the filings. Nothing that would hold up as fraud on its own. But it's a pattern, failed partnerships, people left holding the bag, and now a consulting company with almost no real business funded quietly by your husband. I didn't say much in response. I was starting to understand that patterns were the whole story here, not one dramatic betrayal, but years of small, careful movements, each one unremarkable on its own. Each one part of something much larger when you finally saw them together. At home, Eric had grown almost unnervingly relaxed. It was strange watching him during those weeks, knowing what I now knew, and seeing how little it seemed to weigh on him. If anything, he seemed lighter, more confident. One evening over dinner, out of nowhere, he mentioned retirement. Actual retirement. Not the distant, hypothetical kind we used to joke about when we were younger and broke and dreaming about someday. "I've been thinking," he said, cutting into his chicken like the conversation was the most casual thing in the world. "Maybe we should think about selling the house in a few years. Somewhere warmer, Arizona maybe, or the Carolinas. Somewhere with lower property taxes, better weather for my knees." He laughed a little at his own joke. I smiled and said that sounded nice. 19 years ago, I would have meant it. That night, though, I understood exactly what he was really telling me, even if he didn't realize he was telling me anything at all. He wasn't imagining a future with me in it. He was preparing an exit, dressing it up as a shared dream, so that when the time came when the accounts were finally positioned exactly where he wanted them, the transition would look natural, voluntary, my idea as much as his. I could have confronted him right there at the dinner table. Some nights I lay awake rehearsing exactly what I would say, the words arranging themselves in my head like a script I never delivered. But Rebecca had been clear from our very first meeting. Confrontation without protection was how women lost everything. I needed to be positioned before I ever let him know I understood what he was doing, so instead of anger I chose preparation. Over the following 2 weeks, I worked quietly with Rebecca to secure my own financial footing, moving with the same careful precision Eric himself had apparently used to build his hidden structure. We reviewed the deed to our house, confirming it was jointly titled, which offered some protection but not enough on its own. We documented every joint account, every investment, every asset acquired during our marriage, building a paper trail that would matter enormously if this ever became the legal battle I suspected it eventually would. I opened a separate account in my name alone, modest at first, moving small amounts from my design business earnings. Nothing dramatic enough to raise flags, nothing that would tip Eric off that I'd learned anything at all. It felt strange, almost like I was becoming a version of him, engineering my own quiet structure while smiling across the dinner table every night. But I told myself the difference mattered. I wasn't hiding money to escape accountability. I was protecting myself from a man who had already decided, apparently years ago, that accountability wasn't something he owed me. Eric noticed nothing. That was perhaps the strangest part of those weeks, how easily I moved through our life together, attentive, affectionate, even while building a case against him behind a smile that had become second nature. He complimented me on a new client project. He brought home flowers one Friday for no particular reason, the kind of gesture that used to mean something, and now felt like a data point, another piece of a performance I was only now learning to see clearly. Rebecca checked in with me twice that week, mostly logistics signatures, needed documents to gather small legal mechanisms she was quietly putting into place to freeze certain shared assets from further movement, without either of us technically knowing the freeze had occurred. David, meanwhile, had gone quiet for several days, deep in the financial trail tracing where exactly all that money had gone once it left Meridian Consulting Group. Then on a Thursday evening, while Eric was out predictably at what he'd told me was a late client dinner, David called. "Stephanie," he said, and something in his voice made me sit down before I even realized I was doing it. "I found where the money's actually going. It's not staying in the LLC. It's moving somewhere else entirely." David asked if he could come by Rebecca's office the next morning, instead of explaining everything over the phone, and something in the careful way he said it told me this wasn't a conversation meant for a rushed evening call. I barely slept that night. Eric came home around 10, kissed my forehead, mentioned something about the client dinner running long, and I nodded and said nothing, the way I had trained myself to do for weeks now. I lay beside him in the dark, listening to his breathing even out into sleep, wondering what exactly David had found that made his voice sound so careful. The next morning I sat across from Rebecca and David in that same clean office with the river view, and David laid out a series of printed pages across the table, each one a piece of a financial trail he'd spent the better part of 2 weeks reconstructing. "The money from Meridian doesn't sit still," he explained, tracing a line across one of the pages with his finger. "It moves through 2 other business accounts first, both registered to Natalie Brooks, both looking on paper like legitimate consulting revenue. From there, it gets reinvested. Real estate, mostly. Investment properties, 3 of them so far that I've traced, all purchased under separate shell companies. Different names, different registered agents. But the funding source traces back to the same place every time. He slid a final document across the table, a property record for a lake house 2 states away purchased 18 months earlier under a company called Brightwater Holdings. The listed manager was Natalie Brooks. The initial capital contribution, according to the filing, had come from a business loan that, when David traced the originating funds, led directly back through Meridian and eventually back to Eric. "He's not just having an affair," Rebecca said quietly, watching my face as she spoke. "He's building an entire second financial life, funded quietly out of accounts you don't have full visibility into, structured through a woman who has apparently helped other people move money before under murkier circumstances. This is deliberate, Stephanie. This isn't a man who got emotionally involved and lost his head. This is a man who's been executing a plan." I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the property record, the shell company name, the careful architecture of it all. And something shifted in me. Then, not sadness exactly, though the sadness was still there, buried somewhere beneath the surface. What rose up instead was a strange, clarifying kind of clarity. I finally understood the shape of what I'd been looking at for weeks. Natalie wasn't the point. She never had been. She was infrastructure, a means of moving money in ways that would look to any casual observer like unrelated business activity, rather than a husband quietly redirecting marital assets before an exit he'd been planning for years. The coffee shop meetings, the folders passed back and forth, the careful choreography of arriving and leaving separately, none of it had been about romance at all, not primarily. It had been about logistics. Everything Eric had built, I realized, depended entirely on one condition: that I never asked a single question. "What matters legally," Rebecca said, "is intent. Proving the affair might get you a sympathetic judge, but proving that he's been deliberately moving marital assets outside the marriage, positioning himself to walk away with far more than his fair share, that's what protects your financial future. That's what we need to be airtight." Over the following days, I worked with Rebecca to file what she called protective motions, quiet legal mechanisms, that would freeze certain accounts from further movement, effective the moment they were filed, without requiring Eric's immediate knowledge or consent. It felt strange, almost surreal, signing documents that would legally intervene in my own marriage, while Eric sat 2 rooms away in his home office humming along to something on the radio, utterly unaware that the walls around his careful structure were quietly closing in. I also asked David to help me gather everything into a single organized file: bank statements, property records, the LLC ownership documents, the transfer histories, all of it arranged chronologically, undeniable, complete. Rebecca called it building a record. I privately thought of it as building the truth laid out in a form no one could argue with, no one could talk their way around. At home, life continued in its strange, doubled rhythm. Eric remained affectionate, relaxed, entirely himself, the version of himself I'd fallen in love with 19 years earlier, charming and warm and endlessly reassuring. He helped me carry groceries in from the car. He asked about my design clients with what seemed like genuine interest. One evening, he pulled me close on the couch during a movie neither of us were really watching, and told me quietly that he was grateful for me, for us, for how steady things had always been between us. I let him hold me. I didn't pull away. Some nights I wondered if that made me dishonest too, allowing him to believe nothing had changed while I quietly assembled the evidence of everything that had. But I told myself there was a difference between deception built to protect yourself and deception built to exploit someone who trusted you. I was doing the former. Eric for years now had been doing the latter. By the end of that week, Rebecca called with an idea that stopped me mid-step in my kitchen. "I think it's time," she said, "to bring everyone into the same room, not a courtroom, not yet. Somewhere private, somewhere controlled, where we can lay everything out at once, Eric, Natalie, the documentation, all of it. Sometimes the most effective thing isn't a legal filing. It's simply forcing the truth into a room no one can escape." I asked her when. "Whenever you're ready," she said. "But Stephanie, once we do this, there's no going back to pretending. You need to be sure." I looked around my kitchen, the one Eric and I had renovated together 8 years earlier, the one where he'd once helped me pick out cabinet hardware, laughing about how ridiculous it was that 2 grown adults could spend 45 minutes debating brushed nickel versus matte black. Nothing about that memory felt like a lie. And that, I realized, was the strangest part of all of this. Some of it had probably been real, and some of it apparently had been architecture all along. "I'm ready," I told her. I rented a small private conference room downtown in a business center 2 floors above a law firm. Rebecca sometimes worked with the kind of neutral, unremarkable space that could belong to anyone and meant nothing to either Eric or Natalie. Glass walls facing a hallway, a long table with 8 chairs, a pitcher of water no one would end up touching. I chose it deliberately. Nothing about it whispered home or marriage or 19 years of shared history. It was simply a room, and rooms don't take sides. I invited Eric myself, calling him on a Tuesday and telling him I needed to discuss something important about our finances, something that couldn't wait for a casual conversation at home. He sounded mildly curious, maybe a little concerned, but not alarmed, the tone of a man who believed right up until the moment he didn't, that he still had control of the narrative. Rebecca separately arranged for Natalie to be invited under the pretense of a business matter related to Meridian's banking relationships. Something vague enough not to raise suspicion, but official enough to guarantee her attendance. Neither of them knew the other had been asked to appear. That detail mattered more than almost anything else in the plan. Rebecca had been firm about it from the beginning. "People tell the truth," she'd said, "when they're caught off guard in front of the one person they were most trying to keep from finding out." I arrived first 20 minutes early and arranged the documents across the table myself: bank transfer records, the Meridian ownership filing, the Brightwater Holdings property record, David's carefully constructed timeline connecting every dollar from its origin to its final resting place. I laid them out in order left to right, a visual trail that told the whole story without a single word needing to be spoken. My hands were steady. I remember being almost surprised by that. Eric arrived next, glancing at the folders spread across the table with a flicker of confusion that hadn't yet turned into alarm. "What's all this?" he asked, settling into a chair across from me, loosening his tie slightly. The posture of a man expecting a conversation about retirement accounts, not a reckoning. I didn't answer right away. I was watching the door. Natalie walked in 2 minutes later, expecting, I imagined, some kind of straightforward business meeting about banking relationships. She stopped mid-step just inside the doorway when she saw Eric already seated at the table. For a moment, neither of them moved. I watched something pass between them, not quite panic, but the visible recalibration of 2 people realizing in the same instant that whatever careful architecture they'd built had just been exposed to daylight. The silence in that room stretched longer than I expected. I let it. Rebecca had told me not to rush it, that silence does work. Confrontation never can, and she was right. I watched Eric's eyes move from Natalie to the documents on the table, and back again, watched the calculation happening behind his expression as he tried to determine exactly how much I knew. "Please sit," I finally said to Natalie, my voice even almost gentle. She sat. I didn't raise my voice once during what followed. I had promised myself that, and Rebecca had reinforced it. No shouting, no accusations flung across the table, nothing that could later be characterized as an emotional outburst, rather than a legitimate presentation of facts. I simply began walking them through the documents one at a time in the same order David had laid them out for me weeks earlier. The transfer history from Eric's business account to Meridian dating back 5 years. The ownership filing naming Natalie as sole founding member. The Brightwater Holdings property record, the lake house purchased 18 months prior, with funds traced directly back through the same chain. Eric tried at first to reframe it. "This is a legitimate business relationship," he said, his voice carrying the practiced confidence I imagine he used with nervous clients. "Meridian does consulting work for several of my accounts. There's nothing illegal about a consulting relationship," I agreed calmly. "There's something very illegal, or at the very least very actionable, about systematically transferring marital assets into shell entities designed to keep them outside the reach of your wife in preparation for a divorce you never once mentioned to me." His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Beside him, Natalie had gone very still, her eyes fixed on the property record for the lake house. And I understood, watching her face, that perhaps even she hadn't fully grasped how directly her name had been tied to the trail. That's when Rebecca entered precisely on cue, followed a moment later by David, both of them carrying additional folders, both of them settling into the 2 remaining chairs at the table, with the calm efficiency of professionals who had done this before. Eric's expression shifted again, the color draining slightly from his face, as he registered exactly what this room actually was. Not a conversation, a presentation, a case already built, already complete, waiting only for this exact moment to be laid in front of him. Mr. Adams, Rebecca said, her tone crisp and entirely professional. Everything in front of you has already been reviewed by forensic accounting. We have 5 years of documented transfers, property records, and corporate filings, establishing a clear pattern of asset concealment. I want to be direct with you. This isn't a negotiation about whether these documents exist. It's a conversation about what happens next. Eric looked at me, then really looked at me in a way he hadn't in weeks, maybe months. I watched something crumble behind his eyes, not quite guilt, not yet, but the specific panic of a man realizing that the woman across the table had spent weeks building an entire case while he'd been congratulating himself on how smoothly everything was going. "Stephanie," he started. "I can explain." "I know," I said quietly. "That's exactly why we're here." Rebecca reached into her bag and withdrew one final envelope, sealed, official-looking, and slid it slowly across the table until it stopped directly in front of Eric. He stared at it for a long moment before reaching for it, his hands for the first time all evening visibly unsteady. He opened it. His face went completely pale. Inside the envelope were 3 documents, and I watched Eric's eyes move across each one, his expression shifting with every page he turned. The first was a formal asset protection order Rebecca had already filed, freezing further movement on the accounts David had traced, effective immediately. The second was a financial injunction related specifically to Meridian and the properties connected to it, a legal mechanism that would require full disclosure and accounting of every dollar that had passed through those channels over the past 5 years. The third was our divorce petition, already drafted, already signed on my end, waiting only for the date to be filled in. Eric set the papers down slowly, his hands still not quite steady, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. I watched him understand in real time that this wasn't the beginning of a conversation. It was the end of one that had actually started weeks earlier without him ever knowing it was happening. "You've already..." he started, then stopped, looking at Rebecca, at David, at the folders still spread across the table. "This is already filed. Some of it," Rebecca said evenly. "The rest will be depending on how the next conversation goes." Eric looked at me again, and I could see him searching for something to say, some version of events that might soften what was so plainly laid out in front of him. "I was going to explain everything," he finally said, his voice quieter now, stripped of the confidence it had carried when he first walked into the room. "I just needed more time. I was going to tell you, Stephanie, I swear I was. I believed in that moment that some part of him actually thought that was true. That somewhere in his mind he had a version of the story where he eventually sat me down and confessed everything gently on his own terms, at a moment of his choosing. But that version required my ignorance to last exactly as long as he needed it to, and not 1 day longer. It required me to keep trusting him right up until he decided I no longer needed to. "You didn't build a future for us," I said quietly. And I remember how calm my own voice sounded, how strange that calm felt given everything underneath it. "You built one that only worked if I never discovered it." Natalie hadn't spoken through any of this. She sat very still, her eyes moving between the documents and Eric's face, and when I finally looked at her directly, she looked away first. She gathered her bag a moment later, stood and left the room without a single word, not an apology, not a denial, nothing. I think in a strange way. That told me everything I needed to know about how much of this had genuinely been about affection, and how much had simply been business she'd gotten too comfortable conducting. Eric stayed a while longer, saying things I mostly don't remember now, apologies that blurred together into a kind of background noise. What I do remember is the moment he finally understood that nothing he said in that room was going to change anything, because the decisions had already been made weeks earlier quietly, while he was busy believing he still held all the control. He left eventually, the envelope still on the table, its contents no longer something he could pretend not to have seen. The months that followed were not dramatic in the way I once imagined they might be back when I first started keeping that black notebook. There was no explosive confrontation beyond that conference room, no public scene, no screaming. Just paperwork and lawyers and the slow, unglamorous process of untangling 19 years of a shared life into 2 separate ones. David's documentation held up exactly as Rebecca had promised it would. The house which we had renovated together, which held 8 years of memories, including 45 minutes spent debating cabinet hardware, remained mine. My finances carefully protected in those quiet weeks before the meeting stayed intact. I didn't seek revenge, not really, though I understand why some people might expect that ending from a story like this one. I didn't need Eric humiliated publicly or punished beyond what the facts themselves demanded. What I wanted in the end was simply what was mine, protected and secure, and the truth laid out clearly enough that no one, including Eric himself, could pretend it had been anything other than what it was. I started my own design firm that following spring, something I'd talked about for years, but never quite found the courage to pursue while I was busy building a life around someone else's plans. It felt strange at first signing a lease under only my own name, but the strangeness faded faster than I expected. There is a particular kind of peace that comes not from winning, but from finally understanding exactly where you stand. Some nights when I let myself think about it, I realize that betrayal isn't always a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it's not a lie spoken once and regretted. Sometimes it's years spent quietly building a life that was never meant to include you. One small transfer, one careful meeting, one folder passed across a table at a time, until one day a stranger has to be the one to tell you the truth about your own marriage. A few months ago, I drove past that same supermarket on Elm Street, the one with the bakery that smells like cinnamon. I hadn't been back since that Saturday. I slowed down without quite meaning to, looking at the entrance, remembering Frank's careful voice, the way he'd chosen to tell me something that wasn't his responsibility to tell, simply because he thought I deserved to know. I smiled, not because I won anything exactly, but because one ordinary Saturday, an older man with 22 years behind that green vest decided that telling the truth mattered more than staying quiet. And that single choice gave me back my life. If you've made it this far with me, thank you for staying until the end. I want to know what you would have done in my place. Would you have confronted him that first night? Or would you have waited the way I did? Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Let's keep walking through these stories together.